jungle breathes, thick, wet, alive. It is 1974, 3 decades after the end of the Second World War, and in the heart of Lubang Island, Philippines, a single figure moves between the shadows. His uniform is torn, but carefully mended. His rifle, a Type 99 Arisaka, polished with obsessive precision. His face, aged but alert, is streaked with mud and years of vigilance. To him, the war has never ended. Japan has not surrendered. The Emperor still commands. His name is Hiroo Onoda, Imperial Japanese Army intelligence officer, born in 1922. And for 29 years after the war's official end, he continued to fight. The jungle was his battlefield. The rustling of leaves, his alarm. Every sound, every shadow, a potential enemy. He moved by moonlight. He hid by day. He read the signs of the forest, like scripture. When he saw smoke from a nearby village, he called it an enemy outpost. When he found leaflets saying the war ended in 1945, he dismissed them as Allied propaganda. He was not insane. He was obedient, because Hiroo Onoda had sworn an oath, never to surrender. Before his deployment in December 1944, his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, had looked him in the eye and said, "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5. But whatever happens, we will come back for you. Until then, you are to continue your mission at all costs." Those words became his gospel. For the next 3 decades, he would live and kill by them. Imagine the sound of that jungle, the hum of cicadas, the thud of rain on palm leaves, and somewhere in the darkness, the click of a rifle bolt. The villagers called him the ghost of Lubang, a phantom soldier haunting the island, stealing rice and bananas at night, firing at anyone who came too close. In the 1950s, he shot at police patrols. In the 1960s, he ambushed search teams. And even in the 1970s, when the world had changed beyond recognition, he still believed the Allies were trying to trick him into surrender. To Onoda, every voice from a loudspeaker was deceit. Every message from a plane was enemy disinformation. Every new decade was another tactic in psychological warfare. He had become a living anachronism, a man trapped inside the echo of a vanished empire. While Japan rebuilt itself into a modern nation of neon lights and bullet trains, Onoda remained in a parallel world, where duty still meant sacrifice, and the emperor's voice still carried divine weight. To most, he was a relic. To him, he was still a soldier. He was not lost. He was waiting. Waiting for his comrades. Waiting for the return of Japan's army. Waiting for orders that would never come. And yet, beneath that unwavering faith, there was humanity. He farmed when he could. He mended his uniform with plant fibers. He wrote coded notes and hid them in bamboo tubes. He still saluted the rising sun each morning, whispering, "For the Emperor, for Japan." In his world, honor was survival, and survival was victory. In 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki entered the Philippine jungle searching for 3 things, as he said, Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. He found the first one, and what he found was not a myth, but a man who had fought a war alone, long after the world had forgotten it. When Onoda finally laid down his rifle, he was 52 years old. He had outlived the empire that sent him there, outlived the comrades who once fought beside him, outlived the war itself. And yet, when he emerged from the forest, in full uniform, sword at his side, still saluting, the world saw something that felt both impossible and inevitable, the last echo of a war that refused to end. Every war leaves behind its ghosts. Some lie beneath the earth, some walk among us, and some, like Hiroo Onoda, never stopped fighting at all. To understand Hiroo Onoda, you must first understand the world that built him. Japan in 1944 was a nation cornered, powerful, proud, and dying in slow motion. The war that had begun in triumph, with the rising sun blazing across Asia, was collapsing. The Allies were advancing. The American Navy ruled the Pacific. Tokyo was burning. But on the radio, the voice of the emperor still spoke of glory. And to millions of young men like Onoda, those words were sacred. Hiru. Onoda was born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, the son of a family of samurai descent. He grew up in a Japan that worshipped the twin gods of duty and death. At school, boys were taught that surrender was the greatest shame. Teachers recited the emperor's rescript to soldiers and sailors, like a prayer. Duty is heavier than a mountain. Death is lighter than a feather. The idea was simple and absolute. A soldier's body belonged not to himself, but to the emperor. To live for oneself was selfish. To die for the emperor was divine. By the time Onoda came of age, Japan had already plunged into total war. He trained as an officer in the Imperial Army's intelligence branch, one of the few divisions that prized cunning over brute strength. His instructors taught him how to survive behind enemy lines, how to live off the land, how to use deception as a weapon. They also taught him something else: never to lose faith. For an intelligence officer, the greatest threat was not the enemy, it was doubt. Once you believed the enemy's lies, you were lost. In December 1944, Onoda received his final orders. He was to be deployed to Lubang Island, a small tropical outpost in the Philippines, to sabotage Allied operations and gather intelligence. His mission was to destroy airstrips and piers, to prevent any enemy foothold. Before departure, his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, called him into a dimly lit room and gave him the words that would define his life. Whatever happens, you are to defend Lubang until our forces return. You are absolutely forbidden to surrender. You may have to hold out for years, but we will come back for you. Onoda saluted. To him, this was not fanaticism, it was loyalty. The emperor's command was eternal, even if the empire itself fell. By the time his ship reached the Philippines, Japan's war was already lost. American forces had seized control of the islands. But in Onoda's mind, defeat was unthinkable. He landed on Lubang with a small unit of men: Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Private Kinshichi Kazuka, and Onoda himself, now the ranking officer. Their orders were clear: fight, sabotage, survive. And if Japan should lose contact, wait for the next command. The jungle was unforgiving, mosquitoes thick as smoke, rain that never stopped, vines that strangled their rifles, and roots that tore through boots. At first, they fought like soldiers, disciplined, alert, united. They ambushed patrols, raided supply huts, and kept their weapons clean. But as months became years, the war outside their island ended, and they did not know. When the emperor announced Japan's surrender in August 1945, Onoda's unit was deep in the forest. Leaflets fluttered down from planes. The war has ended. Lay down your arms. The men read them by torchlight. The paper was real, the ink fresh, but to Onoda, it was a trick. "This is enemy propaganda," he said. "We do not surrender to lies." From that moment on, the jungle became a time capsule. Every year the modern world moved further away, and Onoda moved deeper in. He became the war's ghost. His world froze in 1945, a loop that never ended. Patrols by moonlight, reports written in neat kanji, rumors of the emperor's divine will. When villagers found him and tried to explain the truth, he dismissed them as collaborators. When leaflets showed photographs of Japanese families and Emperor Hirohito in a suit, he thought the images had been forged, because to believe them meant to believe that everything he had done, every raid, every death, had been meaningless, and that was unthinkable. In Japan, people were moving on. Cities were rebuilding, children were learning English, but for Onoda, the empire was still alive, somewhere beyond the horizon. He sharpened his bayonet. He cleaned his rifle. He waited for his commander's return. The world might surrender, but he never would. The jungle became their world. To the men of Lubang, the war was not over. It had only gone silent. The sky no longer rumbled with aircraft, but that only meant the enemy was hiding. Every rustle, every bird call, every footprint in the mud was a possible ambush. Hiru Onoda and his men, Shimada, Kozuka, and Akatsu, lived in constant readiness. They built hidden camps deep in the forest, camouflaged with leaves and bamboo. They stored rice, dried bananas, and occasionally slaughtered a cow from a nearby village, a crime they justified as wartime requisition. To them, every act of survival was an act of resistance, and in the heart of their fading empire, that resistance was sacred. At night, Onoda wrote in his notebook by the flicker of a stolen candle. His handwriting was precise, almost beautiful. Enemy activity light today. Shimada patrols South Sector. Morale steady. Awaiting further orders. He did not write for anyone else. He wrote because a soldier must report. A soldier must continue the mission, even when there is no one left to receive it. The first years were full of purpose. The four men repaired their uniforms, cleaned their rifles, and listened for aircraft that never came. They moved through the forest like ghosts, silent, lean, and alert. Every few weeks, they descended from the mountains to raid the villages for food and supplies. To the locals, they were demons. To themselves, they were heroes. They believed the island was under Allied occupation. When they found cans of food with labels in English, they burned them. When villagers shouted in Tagalog, they thought it was a code. Every contradiction became a sign that the enemy was near, proof that the war was still real. Then, Private Akatsu broke. After nearly 5 years in the jungle, the silence began to eat at him. He could no longer bear the endless waiting, the suspicion, the hunger. One night in 1949, he told Onoda that he wanted to leave. Onoda's face hardened. "You cannot. We have our orders." But Akatsu slipped away anyway. He hid for months before finally surrendering to local forces. When leaflets later appeared saying that Akatsu was alive and safe in Japan, Onoda read them and said coldly, "The enemy has turned him." To him, even his own comrade had become part of the lie. The years blurred together, rainy seasons, dry seasons, rice harvests, fires in the distance. Each new decade passed like a single unending day. By the mid-1950s, the group was down to 3 men, Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka. They patrolled in pairs, always circling back to the same hidden clearings, the same bamboo shelters, the same ghosts. When a search party entered the island with loudspeakers in 1952, shouting in Japanese that the war was over, Onoda's men aimed their rifles but did not fire. They listened, then vanished into the trees. "Too perfect," Onoda whispered. "If the war were truly over, they would not try so hard to convince us." It was a logic built not on madness, but on loyalty. Loyalty so deep it had no bottom. In 1954, tragedy struck. Shimada, the quiet corporal, was shot during a brief skirmish with a local patrol. Onoda tried to save him, cleaning the wound with water from a leaf, but infection came quickly in the humid air. For 2 days he listened to Shimada breathe, weaker each hour. Before he died, Shimada whispered, "Don't. Stop fighting," Onoda promised. And when the forest fell silent again, he buried his comrade beneath a mound of ferns and marked it only with a bayonet blade driven into the soil. Now only 2 remained, Onoda and Kozuka. For another 18 years, they lived as shadows. They rationed salt. They wove palm leaves into sandals. They boiled river water in old cans until it tasted of metal and mud. Sometimes, when they sat beside their small fire, Kozuka would speak softly of Japan. "When the war is over," he said once, "I'll open a store. Sell books." Onoda smiled faintly, but said nothing. For him, the war ending was a fantasy, a weakness of imagination. And so he watched the jungle instead, always watching, always waiting. Then, in October 1972, Kozuka was killed, shot by police during a confrontation near a rice paddy. He had followed Onoda to burn harvested grain, to deny supplies to the enemy, as they had done for nearly 3 decades. When Onoda dragged his friend's body into the forest, something inside him cracked, though he could not admit it. For 2 nights, he sat beside the corpse. Then he buried Kozuka and wrote in his journal, "Kozuka died in action. Duty continues, awaiting orders." Now he was alone. Alone with his rifle, his mission, and the ghosts of men who no longer existed. By the time the 1970s arrived, humanity had walked on the moon. Tokyo had hosted the Olympics. But on a small island in the Philippines, one soldier still patrolled, believing the war raged on. Every day, he cleaned his weapon. Every night, he whispered his report to the jungle. All quiet, still awaiting orders. By the early 1970s, the world had forgotten the island of Lubang. The war had been over for nearly 30 years. Empires had fallen, new nations had risen, and Japan, the empire for which Hiroo Onoda had sworn to die, was now a nation of neon lights, bullet trains, and peace slogans. But in the dark heart of the Philippine jungle, one soldier still moved like a shadow. His rifle, a worn Arisaka Type 99, was still oiled. His uniform, patched and faded, still bore the imperial insignia. He was still waiting for an order that would never come. And the world was about to find him. It began with rumors. Farmers in Lubang spoke of a ghost soldier who raided their crops at night. Their carabaos were stolen. Their fields were set on fire. Sometimes in the early dawn mist, they heard Japanese voices echoing from the forest. Just one voice now. At first, no one believed it. But in 1972, when police killed a man named Kozuka in a confrontation, the truth returned to the headlines. The newspapers in Tokyo ran the story. Japanese soldiers still fighting. World War II, 27 years later. And among the millions who read it, one young man, Norio Suzuki, a dreamer, an adventurer, decided to go and find him. He told his friends, "I'm going to look for 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order." It was a joke on the surface. But deep down, Suzuki was serious. He wanted to touch history, to meet the man who refused to surrender to time. February 1974. The air over Lubang was thick and damp. Cicadas screamed, and from the shadows, Onoda watched, as he always had, the strange figures moving through his jungle. But this time, one of them was not a soldier. Suzuki had entered the forest alone, carrying only a backpack, a camera, and a deep respect. He called out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, I am Japanese. The war is over. Please come home." At first there was no answer, only the forest breathing. Then, from behind a curtain of vines, a man's voice, firm, deliberate, spoke. "Who are you?" Suzuki froze. He turned and saw a figure step out of the shadows. A man thin as bamboo, his hair long, his uniform dark with age. In his hands, the Arisaka rifle gleamed faintly. Suzuki said softly, "My name is Norio Suzuki. I'm Japanese, like you. The war ended in 1945. Onoda's eyes, sharp and cautious, studied the stranger. He had seen many traps before, propaganda leaflets, search teams, even supposed rescue missions. All lies. But this man was different. He was young, too young to have fought in the war. His eyes carried no deceit, only wonder. They spoke for hours. Suzuki told him about Japan, how Tokyo was rebuilt, how people now watched color television, how the emperor had grown old and made peace with the world. Onoda listened silently, his face unreadable. Then he said the words he had been repeating for 30 years. My orders were clear. I must not surrender. I must not die by my own hand. I must hold out until my superior officer relieves me of duty. Suzuki felt his heart tighten. This man truly believed the war had never ended. So he asked gently, "If I bring your commanding officer here, will you come home?" Onoda looked at him, long, searchingly, and finally nodded. Yes. If my commander orders it, I will lay down my rifle. Suzuki bowed, and in that moment, a strange bond formed between two generations of Japan, one born in the flames of war, the other in the silence that followed. Suzuki left the island, carrying Onoda's photograph and message. When he reached Japan, the nation erupted in disbelief. People had heard stories of holdouts before, but none had lasted this long. The government moved quickly. They found Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer, now a quiet bookseller living in Tokyo. When the officials told him the story, the old man sat in silence for a long time. Then he whispered, "He did exactly as I ordered." And so, at the age of 71, Taniguchi agreed to travel to Lubang, to finally release his loyal soldier from a war that had ended 3 decades earlier. March 9th, 1974. The jungle was quiet again. Rain dripped from the leaves. Suzuki stood beside Taniguchi as they called out into the trees. Moments later, the bushes rustled, and Onoda appeared. His uniform was torn but clean, his rifle still polished. He saluted sharply, his face calm, his posture unbroken. Taniguchi stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly as he read from a document. The Imperial Japanese Army Headquarters orders Lieutenant Hiro Onoda to cease all combat activities immediately. In accordance with Imperial command, all units are to surrender. Onoda listened without moving. When the words ended, he bowed deeply. Then, with slow precision, he removed his rifle, sword, and ammunition pouch, and laid them on the ground. He said quietly, "I am sorry it took me so long." And for the first time in 30 years, he exhaled, as if letting go of a ghost that had been haunting him since 1945. The next morning, he walked out of the jungle. His steps were slow, deliberate, every muscle remembering discipline. On his shoulders, the same faded pack he had carried since the day the world fell apart. As he reached the edge of the clearing, hundreds of cameras clicked. Reporters cried. Villagers watched in silence. The last soldier of the Second World War, Lieutenant Hiro Onoda, was finally going home. But behind his calm expression, his eyes still searched the horizon. He had lived so long in the shadows of war that peace itself felt unreal, like another trick of the enemy. He whispered one final report under his breath, as if speaking to ghosts. Mission complete. Then he lowered his head, and the jungle at last was silent. Tokyo, March 1974. The city was a storm of neon and noise. Billboards blinked above the streets, television vans crowded intersections, and cameras flashed like artillery fire. And into this new battlefield walked Lieutenant Hiro Onoda, the last soldier of the Emperor. His boots clicked softly on the airport floor as he stepped into the glare of 1,000 lights. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, their microphones trembling like bayonets. "Lieutenant Onoda, how does it feel to be home? Do you regret staying so long? What will you do now?" He blinked beneath the brightness. For nearly 30 years, his world had been the green darkness of the jungle, the hiss of rain on leaves, the whisper of bamboo, the smell of gun oil. Now he stood in a country of chrome and color, surrounded by strangers who called it peace. He bowed formally, his voice steady. "I am sorry that I did not fulfill my duty sooner." The crowd fell silent for a heartbeat. Then the shutters exploded again. Japan did not know what to make of him. To some, he was a relic, a living ghost of the old empire, walking proof of a fanatic devotion that the new Japan wanted to forget. To others, he was a hero, the embodiment of loyalty, discipline, and faith. The government granted him an audience with Emperor Showa. When Onoda entered the palace, he knelt deeply, pressing his forehead to the floor. The emperor, now older and gentler, looked at the soldier who had kept fighting for his name long after the drums of war had stopped. He told Onoda softly, You have struggled long and faithfully. Be at peace." For a moment, Onoda's composure cracked. He bowed again, his voice trembling. "Your Majesty, I only regret that I could not serve better." There were no more orders left to give. No more enemies left to fight. Only silence. The Japanese people showered him with attention. He was on every front page, every television screen. Crowds followed him wherever he went. But Onoda felt no triumph. He felt only confusion. In his absence, Japan had changed beyond recognition. The empire he fought for no longer existed. Its flags were gone. Its military disbanded. Young people walked in jeans, listened to American music, and spoke freely about democracy, even about peace. He looked out the window of his hotel one night and murmured, "Everything I believed in vanished while I was waiting." A psychiatrist was assigned to help him readjust, but Onoda refused. He said he did not need to be treated. He was not broken. He had merely followed orders, yet the world around him felt alien. The sounds of traffic replaced the sounds of rain. The electric hum of Tokyo drowned out the silence of the jungle. He missed the rustle of bamboo, the stars over Lubang, even the discipline of the hunt. When people asked if he was angry about wasting 3 decades, he shook his head. "I did not waste them," he said. "I was a soldier. I did my duty." But inside, he knew that duty had cost him everything: youth, time, and the simple act of believing that the world could change without him. Months passed. He received gifts, medals, interviews, even a government pension, but he could not stay. Tokyo suffocated him. So, in 1975, he left Japan once again. This time not as a soldier, but as a man searching for silence. He moved to Brazil, joining other former Japanese settlers who worked the land. There, among the open fields and the sound of wind in the grass, he found something close to peace. He married a Japanese woman named Machi and tried to rebuild a life without orders, without missions. But even in Brazil, the jungle never left him. Every night before sleeping, he checked the perimeter of his small farm. He cleaned his rifle, now empty, with the same precision as before. It was no longer a weapon. It was memory. In time, he began returning to Japan for lectures, speaking to young people about discipline and perseverance. But he never glorified the war. He spoke of loyalty and its cost. He told them, one must be loyal, but one must also think, blind obedience can destroy everything. He had spent 30 years fighting a war that no longer existed. Now, he spent the rest of his life reminding others never to lose themselves to an idea, even a noble one. One day, a journalist asked him, Lieutenant Onoda, if you could speak to the young soldier you once were, the man who refused to surrender, what would you tell him? Onoda thought for a long time. Then, he answered quietly, I would tell him that the enemy was not the Americans or the Filipinos. The enemy was time. When the interview ended, he looked down at his hands, still steady, still disciplined, and smiled faintly. For the first time in decades, he no longer felt like a soldier, just a man who had finally come home. In the years that followed, Hiroo Onoda became both a symbol and a question. A symbol of endurance, of the kind of faith that defies reason. A question of what that faith truly cost. He had survived where no one should have. But survival, he learned, was not the same as living. In Japan, his story was told in classrooms, newspapers, and television dramas. Children memorized his name. Elderly veterans saluted his return as a miracle. And yet, beneath the admiration, a quiet unease remained. For what did it mean that a man could follow orders so blindly that he fought alone for 3 decades, after his country had surrendered? Some saw him as the perfect soldier. Others as the last casualty of an empire that had demanded obedience above all else. And Onoda himself, standing in the middle of those voices, did not fully know which he was. In 1980, he returned briefly to Lubang Island, this time not as a soldier, but as a man seeking peace. The locals, who once feared him as a phantom of war, now greeted him with warmth and curiosity. He apologized to the families of those he and his men had killed during raids. He bowed low, his voice trembling. "We thought the war was still being fought. We did what we believed our duty required. I am deeply sorry." The villagers accepted his apology with quiet dignity. They, too, had been prisoners of that long, invisible war. Standing beneath the same canopy where he once hid from them, Onoda finally felt the weight of those lost years. Not as pride, but as grief. He realized that the jungle had not been his enemy. It had been his mirror, reflecting his devotion, his stubbornness, his fear of being forgotten. In his later years, Onoda began speaking more openly about what he had learned, not from the empire, but from isolation. He told students, "To be strong is not only to obey, it is to think clearly, even when you are afraid." He no longer saw loyalty as a virtue without question. He saw it as a blade, sharp enough to protect or to wound. "Obedience without understanding," he once said, "is the most dangerous weapon in the world." It was a quiet admission, almost a confession, one that only a man who had lived inside that obedience could make. As the years passed, his legend softened. He wrote books, planted trees, taught survival courses to children. He spoke often of discipline, courage, and resilience, but also of balance. In one of his writings, he reflected, "When I was young, I believed the world was divided, friend or foe, victory or defeat. But the jungle taught me that life is not like that. The world is green, and everything in it struggles to live." There was a gentle sadness in those words. A soldier who had once lived only for his emperor had, at last, learned to live for himself, and for the living. He grew old quietly. His back remained straight, his eyes sharp, his voice calm. But sometimes, when he was alone, his mind wandered back to Lubang. He would remember Kozuka's laughter by the campfire, Shimada's final breath, the rain falling softly on the graves that no one ever found. He had survived, yes, but he had outlived everything that made him feel alive, and in that, there was a tragedy deeper than death. One evening, when asked by a journalist whether he regretted his 30 years in the jungle, he paused for a long time before replying, "Regret? No, but I grieve. I grieve for the years that could have been lived, not fought." It was the closest he ever came to admitting sorrow. For a man raised to see emotion as weakness, grief was a private rebellion, a kind of surrender no battlefield could demand. Hiro Onoda lived to see the turn of the century. He passed away in 2014, at the age of 91. The newspapers called him the last samurai of the empire, but that title missed something deeper. He was not a samurai, nor a relic. He was a mirror, reflecting the fragile line between duty and delusion, between loyalty and loss. When his ashes were scattered, some said he had finally returned to the jungle that once imprisoned him. And perhaps, in some way, he did. Somewhere, beneath the canopy of Lubang, the wind still moves through the trees, and if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. A steady, disciplined whisper, like a voice reporting to no one. All quiet. Mission complete. Mission. When Hiro Onoda returned to Japan in 1974, it was not only a man who came home, it was a ghost. A ghost that forced an entire nation to look into a mirror it had carefully avoided for decades. For 30 years, Japan had rebuilt itself into an economic miracle, a nation of peace and progress. But behind the steel towers and neon lights, there was an unspoken guilt, a silence about the war, about what it meant to obey, to fight, to kill in the name of an emperor who had told them they were divine. And Onoda, walking calmly through that silence, became its voice. Newspapers debated his meaning endlessly. Was he a hero or a warning? Was his devotion admirable or monstrous? The right wing praised him. They called him the embodiment of Yamato spirit, the unbreakable heart of the Japanese warrior. They printed his image beside the rising sun flag, and spoke of honor reborn. The left mourned him. They saw him as a victim of imperial madness, a man brainwashed by the machinery of war. They pitied him, not for his endurance, but for his blindness. And in between these two visions stood Onoda himself, a man who no longer wished to be anyone's symbol. He once said to a reporter, "Do not make me into a lesson. I was a soldier. I obeyed orders. If you want a lesson, look at the people who gave them." That single sentence rippled through Japan like a quiet explosion. Universities began to study his case, not as history, but as psychology. What makes a man obey so completely? What does faith become when it loses its object? And most of all, who bears responsibility when obedience turns into tragedy? Students debated his story late into the night. Some admired his discipline, others pitied his ignorance. A few whispered that perhaps, in his madness, he had been the only sane one, the only man who truly believed in something, while the rest of the world surrendered to convenience. In 1984, a young historian published an essay titled "The Soldier Who Refused to Wake." It argued that Onoda's story was not about war, but about the danger of memory, how nations remember what flatters them and forget what does not. "Japan built a miracle," she wrote, "but it built it on silence. Onoda broke that silence, not by words, but by walking out of the jungle holding a rifle from a dream Japan had already buried." The essay became famous. It reframed Onoda not as a relic, but as a reminder that the past is never truly gone, only waiting to be found again. Over time, the debates softened. Children learned of him in textbooks, a curious story from a faraway time. They looked at the photographs, a thin man in a tattered uniform, bowing as he surrendered, smiling faintly as he met the emperor. To them, he was unreal, a myth, a ghost from a black and white world. But for those who had lived through the war, the image was unbearable. They remembered the sound of sirens, the taste of ash in the air, the years when duty was everything and thought was treason. Onoda's face was the mirror of all they had chosen to forget. In the 1990s, as Japan's economic confidence began to waver, Onoda's name resurfaced again, this time as a metaphor for resistance. Businessmen quoted his never-surrender spirit in motivational speeches. Self-help books called him the ultimate survivor. He became, once again, a product of the very society that had once abandoned him. And perhaps, deep down, Japan needed that version of him. Not the fanatic, not the lost soldier, but the survivor who never broke. Because to remember the truth, that obedience can destroy as surely as war, was still too hard. When Onoda died in 2014, his funeral was attended by soldiers, historians, and a few of the people from Lubang. The emperor sent condolences. Television anchors spoke reverently of his unshakable spirit. Few spoke of the blood spilled in those jungles, or of the lonely madness that had kept him alive. One old reporter, who had covered his return in 1974, wrote a short piece for the evening paper. It ended with these words: "We called him a hero because it was easier than calling him a mirror. But in truth, Onoda was both. He showed us the best and worst of who we are when we stop asking why." Today in Tokyo, there is a small display in the Yasukuni War Museum that includes Onoda's rifle, his faded uniform, and the weathered knife he carried through 30 years of darkness. Beside it, a plaque reads simply, "He fought the longest war." But there is no plaque to say why. And perhaps that too is part of the silence. Somewhere, in a classroom, a student reads his story and asks the same question every generation must face: would I have obeyed too? And there, in that question, whispered, uncertain, afraid, Hiroo Onoda's war finally continues. There is a silence that follows every war. Not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion. The silence of those who have seen too much, believed too deeply, and returned to find the world unrecognizable. For Hiroo Onoda, that silence followed him to the very end. In the final years of his life, he rarely spoke publicly. He had said everything he needed to say. not about victory or defeat, but about the cost of belief. When young journalists visited him in his modest Tokyo apartment, they found a man who still woke before dawn, still polished his shoes until they gleamed, still bowed before answering a question. Discipline was not a performance. It was his heartbeat. But behind his calm eyes, there was something softer now. Not regret, but understanding. The jungle was cruel, he told one interviewer, but it was honest. It never lied. It only punished those who refused to listen. He smiled faintly. Perhaps that is what life is, too. He lived simply. He grew flowers on his balcony. He visited schools to speak to children, not about war, but about perseverance. He taught them how to tie knots, how to build a shelter, how to read the forest. Lessons from a life that had long since become legend. And when they asked, wide-eyed, if he was afraid in the jungle, he would laugh softly. Fear is natural, he said. The question is, who commands it? You or it? They loved him for his clarity, not his past. He had become, for them, less a soldier than a teacher, a relic transformed into a human being. Yet the world around him continued to shift. New wars began, new governments rose, new generations grew up without memory of what had come before. To them, World War II was history. To him, it was yesterday. When asked once how he viewed modern Japan, a peaceful, prosperous democracy, he paused before answering. "It is beautiful," he said slowly. But beauty without memory is fragile. He never said it in bitterness. It was not condemnation, only observation. He had lived long enough to see both sides of belief, the discipline that builds and the obedience that destroys. One summer in the early 2000s, Onoda visited a mountain forest in Nagano with a group of students. They built fires, cooked rice, and practiced survival skills. That night, under a sky full of stars, he sat quietly apart from the others. The wind rustled through the pines. A student approached and asked what he was thinking about. He looked up and said, "The jungle never left me. Sometimes I still wake and expect to hear Kozuka's voice, or the rain on the leaves. Then I remember. It is gone. Time has won." The boy didn't know how to answer. Onoda smiled gently and patted his shoulder. "But perhaps that's all right. We cannot fight forever." In his later writings, he stopped using the word duty. He began to use another. Balance. He wrote, "To live only by reason is to forget the heart. To live only by belief is to forget the mind. The jungle taught me both must live together." It was a quiet philosophy, born not from textbooks, but from decades of solitude and struggle. He never called it wisdom, only the price of time. When he died in January 2014, Tokyo's winter was cold and still. News outlets called him the soldier who never surrendered, the man out of time, the last warrior. They repeated the same phrases, the same photographs, the same simplified legends. But in the apartment he left behind, there were no medals, no uniforms, no symbols of war. Only a notebook, filled with careful handwriting. In one of its final pages he had written, "The war ended, but belief does not end when orders stop. It ends when a man learns to forgive himself." At his memorial, his widow Machi spoke quietly before the gathered crowd. "He lived as a soldier," she said, "but he died as a man who finally understood peace." In the back row, a few former soldiers wept. Outside, reporters waited, ready to turn his death into headlines. But inside the hall, for a moment, there was only stillness, a silence heavy with gratitude and sorrow. Years later, a young historian visiting Lubang Island wrote in her journal, "There is no trace of Onoda here now. The jungle has reclaimed everything, his camps, his paths, even his memories. Only the trees remain, and the sound of the rain. It is as if the island itself forgave him." She stood for a long time beneath the same canopy where he once hid, listening to the rustling leaves, and in that moment she thought she heard it, a whisper, barely more than wind, mission complete. The war was over long before Hiru Onoda laid down his rifle. But peace, true peace, took a lifetime to learn. And when it finally came, it came not as victory, but as silence. A silence that did not erase what had been done, but accepted it, and at last let it rest.